The argument in the paper starts out by saying, suppose people, what would economic life be like if people didn't have social relationships? And I said, well, that's a thought experiment. And it's a thought experiment that is very hard to accomplish because people always do have social relationships. But if you look at the way people have analyzed the economy, they have tended to go in two different directions. Either they have taken what I call the under-socialized approach, which is typical of classical and modern economics, which is that people are basically pursuing their own self-interest and their social relationships don't matter. All that matters is what they're doing in the economy. So that's under-socialized. But then there was a sociological view, which is that people's activities in the economy or anywhere else were completely regulated by the norms and values they had acquired from their socialization, from their childhood, from their people around them. And that's what Dennis Wrong had called, another sociologist had called, the over-socialized conception of man in modern sociology. And I said in this paper, look, you might think these are opposites. You know, one has people that are completely out for themselves and are not paying any attention to anything else. Another has people who are completely in the completely under the control of these norms and values that they've absorbed from the larger society. But there's a funny sense in which these two extreme views coincide with one another, in the sense that they both ignore people's social relationships. And once you take people's social relationships into account, you get a different picture of the economy. Because a lot of what happens in the economy happens through social relationships. People carry out a lot of their economic activities through social relationships. And once you take that into account, and I called that embeddedness, I said that people are, people's economic activity is embedded in their networks of social relations, and that whether or not people can trust each other, which is a big problem in any economic set of outcomes, depends on what kind of social network and social relationships they have. One thing I didn't say that people often make the mistake of attributing to me or attributing to economic sociology is that people's social relationships always lead them to trust one another. This is a mistake. I mean, whether there is trust is a complicated issue. It depends on how the network of social relationships is set up. In fact, it's very important to keep in mind that when you trust other people, you are much more vulnerable than if you didn't. So that the fact that you have a social relationship with someone may make you think that you can trust them and you don't have to pay attention to what they're doing. But if the other person has bad intentions toward you, as sometimes is the case, we talk about the so-called confidence rackets, where people simulate interest in you and simulate social relationships so that they can deceive you. So that when you have a social relationship and when you trust another person, then you're much more vulnerable to them than if they were strangers, because then you would be wary. So it's not an automatic thing that you have trust because you have social networks. But it did seem to me that the argument that Williamson made in Markets and Hierarchies failed because he didn't take into account, he just assumed that everyone interacting with one another in the economy were strangers to one another. And if that were the case, then it might be true that in order to reduce transaction costs, that when transactions got complicated, they would always have to be internalized into firms. But in fact, when you look at real markets, you see small independent firms carrying on very complicated transactions with one another. Silicon Valley, for example, or many high-tech regions are examples of that, or the so-called Third Italy, where these textile firms carry out very complicated relationships with one another. And the reason they can do that is because they have social networks of relationships connecting these firms that make it possible for them to interact with one another and resolve some of these problems that would otherwise occur. And so it seemed to me that you had to take that into account to get any kind of reasonable account of the economy.